Monomyth.
Joseph Campbell's Monomyth, or the hero's journey, is a basic pattern that its proponents argue is found in many narratives from around the world. This widely distributed pattern was described by Campbell in The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Campbell, an enthusiast of novelist James Joyce, borrowed the term monomyth from Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. Campbell held that numerous myths from disparate times and regions share fundamental structures and stages, which he summarized in The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Campbell and other scholars, such as Eric Newman, describe narratives of Gautama Buddha, Moses, and Christ in terms of the monomyth, and Campbell argues that classic myths from many cultures follow this basic pattern.
Summary.
In a monomyth, the hero begins in the ordinary world, and receives a call to enter an unknown world of strange powers and events. The hero who accepts the call to enter this strange world must face tasks and trials either alone or with assistance. In the most intense versions of the narrative, the hero must survive a severe challenge, often with help. If the hero survives, he may achieve a great gift or boon. The hero must then decide whether to return to the ordinary world with this boon. If the hero does decide to return, he or she often faces challenges on the return journey. If the hero returns successfully, the boon or gift may be used to improve the world. The stories of Osiris, Prometheus, Moses, Gautama Buddha, for example, follow this structure closely. Campbell describes 17 stages or steps along this journey. Very few myths contain all 17 stages, some myths contain many of the stages, while others contain only a few. Some myths may focus on only one of the stages, while other myths may deal with the stages in a somewhat different order. These 17 stages may be organized in a number of ways, including division into 3 sections: departure, sometimes called separation, initiation, and return. Departure deals with the hero's adventure prior to the quest. Initiation deals with the hero's many adventures along the way. And return deals with the hero's return home with knowledge and powers acquired on the journey.
The 17 stages of the Monomyth. Separation. The call to adventure.
The hero begins in a mundane situation of normality from which some information is received that acts as a call to head off into the unknown. Campbell. A forest, a kingdom underground, beneath the waves, or above the sky, a secret island, lofty mountain top, or profound dream state. But it is always a place of strangely fluid and polymorphous beings, unimaginable torments, superhuman deeds, and impossible delight. The hero can go forth of his own volition to accomplish the adventure, as did Theseus when he arrived in his father's city, Athens, and heard the horrible history of the Minotaur. Or he may be carried or sent abroad by some benign or malignant agent, as was Odysseus, driven about the Mediterranean by the winds of the angered god, Poseidon. The adventure may begin as a mere blunder. Or still again, one may be only casually strolling when some passing phenomenon catches the wandering eye and lures one away from the frequented paths of man. Examples might be multiplied, ad infinitum, from every corner of the world.
Refusal of the call.
Often when the call is given, the future hero first refuses to heed it. This may be from a sense of duty or obligation, fear, insecurity, a sense of inadequacy, or any of a range of reasons that work to hold the person in his or her current circumstances. Campbell, refusal of the summons converts the adventure into its negative. Walden boredom, hard work, or culture, the subject loses the power of significant affirmative action and becomes a victim to be saved. His flowering world becomes a wasteland of dry stones and his life feels meaningless, even though, like King Minos, he may through titanic effort succeed in building an empire or renown. Whatever house he builds, it will be a house of death, a labyrinth of cyclopean walls to hide from him his Minotaur. All he can do is create new problems for himself and await the gradual approach of his disintegration.
Supernatural aid.
Once the hero has committed to the quest, consciously or unconsciously, his guide and magical helper appears or becomes known. More often than not, this supernatural mentor will present the hero with one or more talismans or artifacts that will aid them later in their quest. Campbell, for those who have not refused the call, the first encounter of the hero journey is with a protective figure, often a little old crone or old man, who provides the adventurer with amulets against the dragon forces he is about to pass. What such a figure represents is the benign, protecting power of destiny. The fantasy is a reassurance, promise that the peace of paradise, which was known first within the mother womb, is not to be lost. That it supports the present and stands in the future as well as in the past, is Omega as well as Alpha. That though omnipotence may seem to be endangered by the threshold passages and life awakenings, protective power is always and ever present within or just behind the unfamiliar features of the world. One has only to know and trust, and the ageless guardians will appear. Having responded to his own call, and continuing to follow courageously as the consequences unfold, the hero finds all the forces of the unconscious at his side. Mother Nature herself supports the mighty task. And insofar as the hero's act coincides with that for which his society is ready, he seems to ride on the great rhythm of the historical process.
Crossing the threshold.
This is the point where the person actually crosses into the field of adventure, leaving the known limits of his or her world and venturing into an unknown and dangerous realm where the rules and limits are not known. Campbell, with the personifications of his destiny to guide and aid him, the hero goes forward in his adventure until he comes to the threshold guardian at the entrance to the zone of magnified power. Such custodians bound the world in 4 directions, also up and down, standing for the limits of the hero's present sphere, or life horizon. Beyond them is darkness, the unknown and danger. Just as beyond the parental watch is danger to the infant and beyond the protection of his society danger to the members of the tribe. The usual person is more than content, he is even proud, to remain within the indicated bounds, and popular belief gives him every reason to fear so much as the first step into the unexplored. The adventure is always and everywhere a passage beyond the veil of the known into the unknown. The powers that watch at the boundary are dangerous. To deal with them is risky. Yet for anyone with competence and courage the danger fades.
Belly of the whale.
The belly of the whale represents the final separation from the hero's known world and self. By entering this stage, the person shows willingness to undergo a metamorphosis. Campbell, the idea that the passage of the magical threshold is a transit into a sphere of rebirth is symbolized in the worldwide womb image of the belly of the whale. The hero, instead of conquering or conciliating the power of the threshold, is swallowed into the unknown and would appear to have died. This popular motif gives emphasis to the lesson that the passage of the threshold is a form of self-annihilation. Instead of passing outward, beyond the confines of the visible world, the hero goes inward, to be born again. The disappearance corresponds to the passing of a worshipper into a temple, where he is to be quickened by the recollection of who and what he is, namely dust and ashes unless immortal. The temple interior, the belly of the whale, and the heavenly land beyond, above, and below the confines of the world, are one and the same. That is why the approaches and entrances to temples are flanked and defended by colossal gargoyles, dragons, lions, devil slayers with drawn swords, resentful dwarfs, winged bulls. The devotee at the moment of entry into a temple undergoes a metamorphosis. Once inside he may be said to have died to time and returned to the world womb, the world navel, the earthly paradise. Allegorically, then, the passage into a temple and a hero dive through the jaws of the whale are identical adventures, both denoting in picture language, the life-centering, life-renewing act.
Initiation. The road of trials.
The road of trials is a series of tests, tasks, or ordeals that the person must undergo to begin the transformation. Often the person fails one or more of these tests, which often occur in threes. Campbell, once having traversed the threshold, the hero moves in a dream landscape of curiously fluid, ambiguous forms, where he must survive a succession of trials. This is a favorite phase of the myth adventure. It has produced a world literature of miraculous tests and ordeals. The hero is covertly aided by the advice, amulets, and secret agents of the supernatural helper whom he met before his entrance into this region. Or it may be that he here discovers for the first time that there is a benign power everywhere supporting him in his superhuman passage. The original departure into the land of trials represented only the beginning of the long and really perilous path of initiatory conquests and moments of illumination. Dragons have now to be slain and surprising barriers passed, again, again, and again. Meanwhile there will be a multitude of preliminary victories, unretainable ecstasies and momentary glimpses of the wonderful land.
The meeting with the goddess.
This is the point when the person experiences a love that has the power and significance of the all-powerful, all-encompassing, unconditional love that a fortunate infant may experience with his or her mother. This is a very important step in the process and is often represented by the person finding the other person that he or she loves most completely. Campbell, the ultimate adventure, when all the barriers and ogres have been overcome, is commonly represented as a mystical marriage of the triumphant hero's soul with the queen goddess of the world. This is the crisis at the nadir, the zenith, or at the uttermost edge of the earth, at the central point of the cosmos, in the tabernacle of the temple, or within the darkness of the deepest chamber of the heart. The meeting with the goddess, who is incarnate in every woman, is the final test of the talent of the hero to win the boon of love, charity, amor fati, which is life itself enjoyed as the encasement of eternity. And when the adventurer, in this context, is not a youth but a maid, she is the one who, by her qualities, her beauty, or her yearning, is fit to become the consort of an immortal. Then the heavenly husband descends to her and conducts her to his bed, whether she will or not. And if she has shunned him, the scales fall from her eyes. If she has sought him, her desire finds its peace.
Woman as temptress.
In this step, the hero faces those temptations, often of a physical or pleasurable nature, that may lead him or her to abandon or stray from his or her quest, which does not necessarily have to be represented by a woman. Woman is a metaphor for the physical or material temptations of life, since the hero knight was often tempted by lust from his spiritual journey. Campbell, the crux of the curious difficulty lies in the fact that our conscious views of what life ought to be seldom correspond to what life really is. Generally we refuse to admit within ourselves, or within our friends, the fullness of that pushing, self-protective, malodorous, carnivorous, lecherous fever which is the very nature of the organic cell. Rather, we tend to perfume, whitewash, and reinterpret. Meanwhile imagining that all the flies in the ointment, all the hairs in the soup, are the faults of some unpleasant someone else. But when it suddenly dawns on us, or is forced to our attention that everything we think or do is necessarily tainted with the odor of the flesh, then, not uncommonly, there is experienced a moment of revulsion. Life, the acts of life, the organs of life, woman in particular as the great symbol of life, become intolerable to the pure, pure soul. The seeker of the life beyond life must press beyond. The woman, surpassed the temptations of her core, and sought to the immaculate ether beyond.
Atonement with the Father.
In this step the person must confront and be initiated by whatever holds the ultimate power in his or her life. In many myths and stories this is the father, or a father figure who has life and death power. This is the center point of the journey. All the previous steps have been moving into this place, all that follow will move out from it. Although this step is most frequently symbolized by an encounter with a male entity, it does not have to be a male. Just someone or thing with incredible power. Campbell, atonement consists in no more than the abandonment of that self-generated double monster, the dragon thought to be God, superego, and the dragon thought to be sin, repressed id. But this requires an abandonment of the attachment to ego itself, and that is what is difficult. One must have a faith that the Father is merciful, and then a reliance on the mercy. Therewith, the center of belief is transferred outside of the bedeviling God's tight scaly ring, and the dreadful ogres dissolve. It is in this ordeal that the hero may derive hope and assurance from the helpful female figure, by whose magic, pollen charms or power of intercession, he is protected through all the frightening experiences of the father's ego-shattering initiation. For if it is impossible to trust the terrifying father face, then one's faith must be centered elsewhere, Spider-Woman, Blessed Mother. And with that reliance for support, one endures the crisis, only to find, in the end, that the father and mother reflect each other, and are in essence the same. The problem of the hero going to meet the father is to open his soul beyond terror to such a degree that he will be ripe to understand how the sickening and insane tragedies of this vast and ruthless cosmos are completely validated in the majesty of being. The hero transcends life with its peculiar blind spot and for a moment rises to a glimpse of the source. He beholds the face of the father, understands, and the two are atoned.
Apotheosis.
When someone dies a physical death, or dies to the self to live in spirit, he or she moves beyond the pairs of opposites to a state of divine knowledge, love, compassion and bliss. A more mundane way of looking at this step is that it is a period of rest, peace and fulfillment before the hero begins the return. Campbell, those who know, not only that the everlasting lies in them, but that what they, and all things, really are is the everlasting, dwell in the groves of the wish-fulfilling trees, drink the brew of immortality, and listen everywhere to the unheard music of eternal concord.
The ultimate boon.
The ultimate boon is the achievement of the goal of the quest. It is what the person went on the journey to get. All the previous steps serve to prepare and purify the person for this step, since in many myths the boon is something transcendent like the elixir of life itself, or a plant that supplies immortality, or the Holy Grail. Campbell, the gods and goddesses then are to be understood as embodiments and custodians of the elixir of imperishable being but not themselves the ultimate in its primary state. What the hero seeks through his intercourse with them is therefore not finally themselves, but their grace, that is, the power of their sustaining substance. This miraculous energy substance and this alone is the imperishable. The names and forms of the deities who everywhere embody, dispense, and represent it come and go. This is the miraculous energy of the thunderbolts of Zeus, Yahweh, and the Supreme Buddha, the fertility of the reign of Viracocha, the virtue announced by the bell rung in the Mass at the consecration, and the light of the ultimate illumination of the saint and sage. Its guardians dare release it only to the duly proven.
Return. Refusal of the return.
Having found bliss and enlightenment in the other world, the hero may not want to return to the ordinary world to bestow the boon onto his fellow man. Campbell, when the hero quest has been accomplished, through penetration to the source, or through the grace of some male or female, human or animal, personification, the adventurer still must return with his life-transmuting trophy. The full round, the norm of the monomyth, requires that the hero shall now begin the labor of bringing the runes of wisdom, the golden fleece, or his sleeping princess, back into the kingdom of humanity, where the boon may redound to the renewing of the community, the nation, the planet or the 10,000 worlds. But the responsibility has been frequently refused. Even Gautama Buddha, after his triumph, doubted whether the message of realization could be communicated, and saints are reported to have died while in the supernal ecstasy. Numerous indeed are the heroes fabled to have taken up residence forever in the blessed isle of the unaging goddess of immortal being.
The magic flight.
Sometimes the hero must escape with the boon, if it is something that the gods have been jealously guarding. It can be just as adventurous and dangerous returning from the journey as it was to go on it. Campbell, if the hero in his triumph wins the blessing of the goddess or the god and is then explicitly commissioned to return to the world with some elixir for the restoration of society, the final stage of his adventure is supported by all the powers of his supernatural patron. On the other hand, if the trophy has been attained against the opposition of its guardian, or if the hero's wish to return to the world has been resented by the gods or demons, then the last stage of the mythological round becomes a lively, often comical, pursuit. This flight may be complicated by marvels of magical obstruction and evasion.
Rescue from without.
Just as the hero may need guides and assistants to set out on the quest, Oftentimes he or she must have powerful guides and rescuers to bring them back to everyday life, especially if the person has been wounded or weakened by the experience. Campbell, the hero may have to be brought back from his supernatural adventure by assistance from without. That is to say, the world may have to come and get him. For the bliss of the deep abode is not lightly abandoned in favor of the self-scattering of the wakened state. Who having cast off the world, we read, would desire to return again? He would be only there. And yet, in so far as one is alive, life will call. Society is jealous of those who remain away from it, and will come knocking at the door. If the hero is unwilling, the disturber suffers an ugly shock. But on the other hand, if the summoned one is only delayed, sealed in by the beatitude of the state of perfect being, which resembles death, an apparent rescue is effected, and the adventurer returns.
The crossing of the return threshold.
The trick in returning is to retain the wisdom gained on the quest, to integrate that wisdom into a human life, and then maybe figure out how to share the wisdom with the rest of the world. Campbell, the returning hero, to complete his adventure, must survive the impact of the world. Many failures attest to the difficulties of this life affirmative threshold. The first problem of the returning hero is to accept as real, after an experience of the soul-satisfying vision of fulfillment, the passing joys and sorrows, banalities and noisy obscenities of life. Why re-enter such a world? Why attempt to make plausible, or even interesting, to men and women consumed with passion, the experience of transcendental bliss? As dreams that were momentous by night may seem simply silly in the light of day, so the poet and the prophet can discover themselves playing the idiot before a jury of sober eyes. The easy thing is to commit the whole community to the devil and retire again into the heavenly rock dwelling, close the door, and make it fast. But if some spiritual obstetrician has drawn the Shimenawa across the retreat, then the work of representing eternity in time, and perceiving in time eternity, cannot be avoided. The hero returns to the world of common day and must accept it as real.
Master of two worlds.
This step is usually represented by a transcendental hero like Jesus or Gautama Buddha. For a human hero, it may mean achieving a balance between the material and spiritual. The person has become comfortable and competent in both the inner and outer worlds. Campbell, freedom to pass back and forth across the world division, from the perspective of the apparitions of time to that of the causal deep and back, not contaminating the principles of the one with those of the other, yet permitting the mind to know the one by virtue of the other, is the talent of the master. The cosmic dancer, declares Nietzsche, does not rest heavily in a single spot, but gaily, lightly, turns and leaps from one position to another. It is possible to speak from only one point at a time, but that does not invalidate the insights of the rest. The individual, through prolonged psychological disciplines, gives up completely all attachment to his personal limitations, idiosyncrasies, hopes and fears, no longer resists the self-immolation that is prerequisite to rebirth in the realization of truth, and so becomes right, at last, for the great at one meant. His personal ambitions being totally dissolved, he no longer tries to live but willingly relaxes to whatever may come to pass in him. He becomes, that is to say, an anonymity.
Freedom to live.
Mastery leads to freedom from the fear of death, which in turn is the freedom to live. This is sometimes referred to as living in the moment, neither anticipating the future nor regretting the past. Campbell, the hero is the champion of things becoming, not of things become, because he is. Before Abraham was, I am. He does not mistake apparent changelessness in time for the permanence of being, nor is he fearful of the next moment, or of the other thing, as destroying the permanent with its change. Nothing retains its own form. But nature, the greater renewer, ever makes up forms from forms. Be sure there's nothing perishes in the whole universe. It does but vary and renew its form. Thus the next moment is permitted to come to pass.
Other formulations.
Campbell's proposed structure has been expanded and modified since its conception. Many modern characterizations of it add in new steps, such as the hero having a miraculous birth, or combine or prune others. For instance, Phil Corsino, in his book, The Hero's Journey, divides it up into the following 8 steps: the call to adventure, the road of trials, the vision quest, the meeting with the goddess, the boon, the magic flight, the return threshold, the master of 2 worlds. Another 8-step formulation was given by David Adams Leeming in his book, Mythology, The Voyage of the Hero. Miraculous conception and birth, initiation of the hero child, withdrawal from family or community for meditation and preparation, trial and quest, death, descent into the underworld, resurrection and rebirth, ascension, apotheosis, and atonement.
The hero's journey.
The phrase "the hero's journey," to describe the monomyth, first entered into popular discourse through 2 documentaries. The first, released in 1987, The Hero's Journey, The World of Joseph Campbell, was accompanied by a 1990 companion book, The Hero's Journey, Joseph Campbell on His Life and Work, with Phil Corsino and Stuart Brown, eds. The second was Bill Moyers's series of seminal interviews with Campbell, released in 1988 as the documentary and companion book, The Power of Myth. The phrase was then referenced in the title of a popular guidebook for screenwriters, released in the 1990s, The Writer's Journey, Mythic Structure for Writers, by Christopher Vogler. Though they used the phrase in their works, Corsino, Moyers, and Vogler all attribute the phrase and the model of the hero's journey to Joseph Campbell.
Influence of the monomyth.
The monomyth has influenced a number of artists, musicians, poets, and filmmakers, including Bob Dylan and George Lucas.
George Lucas and Star Wars.
In addition to the extensive discussion between Campbell and Bill Moyers broadcast in 1988 on PBS as The Power of Myth, filmed at Skywalker Ranch, on Campbell's influence on the Star Wars films, Lucas himself gave an extensive interview for the biography Joseph Campbell, A Fire in the Mind, Larson and Larson, 2002, pages 541 to 543, on this topic. In this interview, Lucas states that in the early 1970s, after completing his early film, American Graffiti, it came to me that there really was no modern use of mythology. So that's when I started doing more strenuous research on fairy tales, folklore and mythology, and I started reading Joe's books. Before that I hadn't read any of Joe's books. It was very eerie because in reading The Hero with a Thousand Faces I began to realize that my first draft of Star Wars was following classical motifs. p. 541. 12 years after the making of The Power of Myth, Moyers and Lucas met again for the 1999 interview, The Mythology of Star Wars with George Lucas and Bill Moyers, to further discuss the impact of Campbell's work on Lucas's films. In addition, the National Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian Institution sponsored an exhibit during the late 1990s called Star Wars, The Magic of Myth, which discussed the ways in which Campbell's work shaped the Star Wars films. A companion guide of the same name was published in 1997.
Chris Vogler, The Writer's Journey, and Hollywood Films.
Christopher Vogler, a Hollywood film producer and writer, created a 7-page company memo, A Practical Guide to the Hero with a Thousand Faces, based on Campbell's work. Vogler's memo was later developed into the late 1990s book, The Writer's Journey, Mythic Structure for Writers.
The men's movement.
Poet Robert Bly, Michael J. Mead, and others involved in the men's movement have applied and expanded the concepts of the hero's journey and the monomyth as a metaphor for personal spiritual and psychological growth, particularly in the myth-or-poetic men's movement. Characteristic of the myth-or-poetic men's movement is a tendency to retell fairy tales and engage in their exegesis as a tool for personal insight. Using frequent references to archetypes as drawn from Jungian analytical psychology, the movement focuses on issues of gender role, gender identity and wellness for modern men. Advocates would often engage in storytelling with music, these acts being seen as a modern extension to a form of New Age shamanism popularized by Michael Harner at approximately the same time. Among its most famous advocates were the poet Robert Bly, whose book Iron John, a book about men, was a bestseller, being an exegesis of the fairy tale Iron John by the Brothers Grimm. The myth or poetic men's movement spawned a variety of groups and workshops, led by authors such as Bly and Robert L. Moore. Some serious academic work came out of this movement, including the creation of various magazines and non-profit organizations, such as the Mankind Project.
Criticism.
Scholars have questioned the very validity of the monomyth, its usefulness as a tool for critical investigation and interpretation of narrative, and its male bias. According to Leslie Northup, the theory does not have much support in the mainstream study of mythology, which currently tends to view highly general and universal claims with suspicion. Donald J. Constantino remarks, "It is just as important to stress differences as similarities, to avoid creating a Joseph Campbell soup of myths that loses all local flavor." Marta Weigel rejects the idea of a monomyth in which women appear only exceptionally, and then as indistinguishable from men. Others have found the categories Campbell works with so vague as to be meaningless, and lacking the support required of scholarly argument. Muriel Crespi, writing in response to Campbell's filmed presentation of his model, characterized it as unsatisfying from a social science perspective. Campbell's ethnocentrism will raise objections, and his analytic level is so abstract and devoid of ethnographic context that myth loses the very meaning supposed to be embedded in the hero. In Sacred Narrative, Readings in the Theory of Myth, 1984, editor Alan Dundes dismisses Campbell's work, characterizing him as a popularizer. Like most universalists, he is content to merely assert universality rather than bother to document it. If Campbell's generalizations about myth are not substantiated, why should students consider his work? The novelist David Brin has criticized the monomyth, arguing that it is anti-populist, and was used by kings and priests to justify tyranny. Brin also pointed out that the existence of a monomyth may reflect cross-cultural historical similarities, rather than some deeper human insight. He points out that, until relatively recently, storytellers were dependent upon the oligarchy for their livelihood, and that the aristocracy only recently lost its power to punish irreverence. Once those historical factors disappeared, science fiction emerged, a storytelling mode Brin sees as the antithesis of Campbell's monomyth. While Frank Herbert's Dune in the surface appears to follow the monomyth, this was in fact to subvert it and take a critical view. As the author said in 1979, the bottom line of the Dune trilogy is, beware of heroes. Much better rely on your own judgment, and your own mistakes. He wrote in 1985, Dune was aimed at this whole idea of the infallible leader because my view of history says that mistakes made by a leader, or made in a leader's name, are amplified by the numbers who follow without question. In a similar vein, American philosopher John Shelton Lawrence and American religious scholar Robert Jewett have discussed an American monomyth in many of their books, The American Monomyth, The Myth of the American Superhero, and Captain America and the Crusade Against Evil, The Dilemma of Zealous Nationalism. They present this as an American reaction to the Campbellian monomyth. The American monomyth storyline is, a community in a harmonious paradise is threatened by evil. Normal institutions fail to contend with this threat. A selfless superhero emerges to renounce temptations and carry out the redemptive task. Aided by fate, his decisive victory restores the community to its paradisiacal condition. The superhero then recedes into obscurity. Some scholars have disagreed with the concept of the monomyth, because of its oversimplification of different cultures. According to Robert Elwood, a tendency to think in generic terms of people, races, is undoubtedly the profoundest flaw in mythological thingamajourney.
The 17 stages of the monomyth. Separation. The call to adventure.
The hero begins in a mundane situation of normality from which some information is received that acts as a call to head off into the unknown. Campbell. A forest, a kingdom underground, beneath the waves, or above the sky, a secret island, lofty mountain top, or profound dream state. But it is always a place of strangely fluid and polymorphous beings, unimaginable torments, superhuman deeds, and impossible delight. The hero can go forth of his own volition to accomplish the adventure, as did Theseus when he arrived in his father's city, Athens, and heard the horrible history of the Minotaur. Or he may be carried or sent abroad by some benign or malignant agent, as was Odysseus, driven about the Mediterranean by the winds of the angered god, Poseidon. The adventure may begin as a mere blunder. Or still again, one may be only casually strolling when some passing phenomenon catches the wandering eye and lures one away from the frequented path. If the hero survives, he may achieve a great gift or boon. The hero must then decide whether to return to the ordinary world with this boon. If the hero does decide to return, he or she often faces challenges on the return journey. If the hero returns successfully, the boon or gift may be used to improve the world. The stories of Osiris, Prometheus, Moses, Gautama Buddha, for example, follow this structure closely. Campbell describes 17 stages or steps along this journey. Very few myths contain all 17 stages, some myths contain many of the stages, while others contain only a few. Some myths may focus on only one of the stages, while other myths may deal with the stages in a somewhat different order. These 17 stages may be organized in a number of ways, including division into 3 sections: departure, sometimes called separation, initiation, and return. Departure deals with the hero's adventure prior to the quest. Initiation deals with the hero's many adventures along the way. And return deals with the hero's return home with knowledge and powers acquired consciously or unconsciously. His guide and magical helper appears or becomes known. More often than not, this supernatural mentor will present the hero with one or more talismans or artifacts that will aid them later in their quest. Campbell, for those who have not refused the call, the first encounter of the hero journey is with a protective figure, often a little old crone or old man, who provides the adventurer with amulets against the dragon forces he is about to pass. What such a figure represents is the benign, protecting power of destiny. The fantasy is a reassurance, promise that the peace of paradise, which was known first within the mother womb, is not to be lost. That it supports the present and stands in the future as well as in the past, is Omega as well as Alpha. That though omnipotence may seem to be endangered by the threshold passages and life awakenings, protective power is always and ever present within or just behind the unfamiliar features of the world. One has only to know and trust, and the ageless guardians will appear. Having responded to his own call, and continuing to follow courageously as the consequences unfold, the hero finds all the force.
Monomyth.
Joseph Campbell's Monomyth, or the hero's journey, is a basic pattern that its proponents argue is found in many narratives from around the world. This widely distributed pattern was described by Campbell in The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Campbell, an enthusiast of novelist James Joyce, borrowed the term monomyth from Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. Campbell held that numerous myths from disparate times and regions share fundamental structures and stages, which he summarized in The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Campbell and other scholars, such as Eric Newman, describe narratives of Gautama Buddha, Moses, and Christ in terms of the monomyth, and Campbell argues that classic myths from many cultures follow this basic pattern.
Summary.
In a monomyth, the hero begins in the ordinary world, and receives a call to enter an unknown world of strange powers and events. The hero who accepts the call to enter this strange world must face tasks and trials either alone or with assistance. In the most intense versions of the narrative, the hero must survive a severe challenge, often with helps of man. Examples might be multiplied, ad infinitum, from every corner of the world.
Refusal of the call.
Often when the call is given, the future hero first refuses to heed it. This may be from a sense of duty or obligation, fear, insecurity, a sense of inadequacy, or any of a range of reasons that work to hold the person in his or her current circumstances. Campbell, refusal of the summons converts the adventure into its negative. Walden boredom, hard work, or culture, the subject loses the power of significant affirmative action and becomes a victim to be saved. His flowering world becomes a wasteland of dry stones and his life feels meaningless, even though, like King Minos, he may through titanic effort succeed in building an empire or renown. Whatever house he builds, it will be a house of death, a labyrinth of cyclopean walls to hide from him his minotaur. All he can do is create new problems for himself and await the gradual approach of his disintegration.
Supernatural aid.
Once the hero has committed to the quest, conscious